Hello, friends. Today I'm here to do a little mix fix on my friend's Mike Merritt's song Little Wonders. It's a cover, and he basically sent me the song, and I said, hey, man, here's some things that you can do a little differently, maybe to clean up the mix. The first thing I noticed outright is even at the smallest possible setting, your mix already looks a little, how do you say, sausagey. This is the mix that I was sent, and you'll notice on the left side, I have the same exact spectral analyzer open, and the reason for that is I want it to be in perfect comparison without any other variables right here. So after you hear the original, I'm going to actually lower the input trim by about 4 dB on his reference mix, so it's the same level of loudness as mine, and I'll show you what I mean. So right away, you can hear how crushed it is, and you can see that it's got that, like, nearing -5 dB RMS loudness and a really small crest factor of about 4.7, 4.6 per channel at the most dynamic. So it's not the most dynamic, but it's a very dynamic song. So first thing I'm going to do is lower the input trim so that it's on the same level of dB RMS about, because, you know, people have volume controls in real life, so why not here to demonstrate the same kind of level of loudness. Thinking about 9 to 10 to 8, so now hear my version of the intro at least. Now, it may be a little difficult to hear, but I'm hitting around the same peaks. The choruses are going to get louder, so I left enough headroom for it to dynamically go up to about 9 to 8 dB RMS with a little bit of a higher crest factor. So, right off the bat, I can tell you, if you're using Voxengo's span, you're going to have to start mixing it with the DBFS +3 version of metering, because by default, the DBFS metering will not show you the proper RMS. You're going to have to use +3. Because otherwise, look at this. It'll show you that you're much quieter than you actually are. Trust me, there have been plenty of tests done with it. The free version of Voxengo Span definitely has that problem. You can look at Ian Shepard, I believe, who did one of those studies, and he can corroborate that. So, now that we've seen the difference, how did I get the sound that I got? Well, if you listen to the drums in this version, not only can you hear that there's this almost hollow sound, but you can actually see that too. The song that has your mix, heavily lacking in the mid-range. It's not a big deal. I mean, on most monitors, you might not even be able to hear it that well, but on these monitors and these headphones that I'm using, it definitely makes a difference. It makes it sound much more hollow. So if you listen to just my drums soloed, without any of the mastering stuff on, and then with the mastering stuff on, you'll notice that they sound a lot less clicky and a lot less hollow. Well, let's start off really quick by getting rid of all of... This is what your drums with MT Power Drummer will sound like by default. Not bad, not horrible, but those cymbals sound a little lifeless. So what I did to work on that was I gave them a little bit more low end so you get more of the body of the cymbal. High passed it just enough so that you don't get any of that, like, awkward resonance in the lower range with these recorded samples. And then I compressed it just enough with a slower compression. Personally, I'm a big fan of like the LA2A and Cakewalk's CA2A and basically emulations of that particular piece of gear. So you see what I'm doing here is comping it just so that it's getting like 1 to 3 dB of gain reduction at any given time. Just because I want some of the more dynamic stuff to still be audible, but maintain like the dynamic feel. So I don't want to go straight for the velocity and turn that up. I want it to be even, but not dynamic-less. So with the kick, first thing I noticed was it sounds like a click. It sounds like a click with a little bit of thump. But it sounds dead. To be completely honest here, I'm not a big fan of the kick, but you gotta do what you gotta do with MT Power Drummer. It's free, and I know you don't want to really spend money on any drummers yet, so here's a way you can help to get this thicker, fuller, stronger sound. First off, yes, I boosted the top end with a free EQ by Variety of Sound called Boot Eq Mk2, which emulates an SSL channel. I took a wide enough scoop out of the lower mid-range where there was a weird resonance. If you listen to it, boosted. It's got like a pillowy sound to it, so I just cut a little bit of that to make more room for the clarity of the drum. And I also boosted in the low end between 60 and 80 hertz, which, if you're any good at math, that means 70 hertz. So I boosted 70 hertz, I boosted the low floor a little bit over here with a tube emulation on the channel. I pushed the drive a little bit so that you could feel it a little bit more with harmonic resonance. Honestly, what I don't like about this particular sample is that you can almost hear the sound of the drum moving a little bit, where like the pedal itself, you've got that like almost flamey sound. So turning off that particular EQ, turning it back on, you're getting a lot more life out of it. Yes, you're scooping it a little, but it is what it is. And also, I have it set over here so that about 7.5 to 8 kilohertz, you've got a little bit of a boost, just so that you can feel the click a little bit more without it sounding like a flam. So I actually, because I don't like the sound of the click on this particular kick, except in the higher register, I took out about 1 or 2 dB of 4 kilohertz with Sun EQ, again, a free EQ. I passed it to about 25 hertz so that there's not a lot of low-end rumble, but there's a little bit more low-end precision. It tightens up the low end. I also low-passed it above 13.6 kilohertz, and again, boosted it over 8 kilohertz. So that you can get more of that click, but also get rid of all the awkward high-end resonance that, again, is inherent to the sample. So, bypassing this, it definitely makes the kick less abrasive, but also makes it feel more in your face, like in your head space, where a kick's click should reside, in my opinion. Now, moving on to the next one in series, I have this plugin that's basically a compressor, but more than compression, it's also doing total harmonic distortion, saturation, like a solid state console. So this is the Thrill Seeker LA, which is, again, one of those LA2A-ish kind of emulations. But what I'm doing here is adjusting the attack so that it comes well after the transient, so that you're just cutting down on that oomph afterwards, and then the release is faster, so that it really just makes the click of the kick stand out while keeping the punch, but not lasting forever or sustaining crazy long. I also have this sidechain low cut where I think around 120 hertz would be, so that you're not pushing the compressor to compress the kick every time there's a lower hit. It only really gets the click to make it less offensive. Again, you want to hear the click of the kick. You don't want it to be offensive and hurt people's ears. So here, I have G-clip, which, if you push it all the way, will sound like garbage. I'm basically just clipping the tops of the transients a little bit to make the kick stand out more and to make the transient tamed, but also give it a little more of that oomph. You can feel it, because without it, it feels like a regular kick, but with it, you get some of that more like punchy in-your-face meat. Okay, moving on from the kick, you've got this snare. The snare, in my opinion, is the least offensive sample in all of MT Power Drummer. I kid you not. So, first thing I did was boot EQ again, because I love my SSL channels. Check it out, friend. Boot EQ. Already pushing that drive into that vintage tube emulation, raising the low floor, increasing the 200 hertz range by about 3 dB, gave it a lot more fatness. Listen with and without the EQ. I pushed up the top end by about 4 dB. I increased the honky mid-range just ever so slightly in the 2 kilohertz range because I kind of wanted it to stick out more. So this is what it would sound like if I cranked it even more. But I don't like that sound at all. But without it, it doesn't stand out in the mix at all. Even just lowering it a little bit. So I increase it just ever so slightly so it can compete with the guitars. I also removed some of that, how do you say, paperiness around 500 to 700 hertz. But only a little bit. I don't want to get rid of all the body of the snare, or the wood sound of the snare. So about 2 dB with a small Q. If I cranked it, hear that? But if you get rid of too much of it, it becomes hollow as heck. So, just a little bit. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, the tube's actually working a lot harder on this one. I increased the low floor just a little bit, and I pushed the drive so that it's starting to get closer to the red, but it isn't peaking necessarily. So then from there, I go to Sun EQ. I actually cut down a little bit more on the areas around 2 kilohertz with this because I have a mid to high Q, or rather a high Q for the mid-range. So what that's doing is it's creating a large curve where everything around 2 kilohertz is getting pushed down by about 1 dB, but I also still have that slight peak from this at around 2 kilohertz. So basically what I'm doing is I'm pushing down on everything around 2 kilohertz overall, while still keeping 2 kilohertz itself just peaky enough that it'll stick out in the mix. It's a weird little trick that I've learned, but, I mean, it seems counterintuitive, right? You don't want to push it down, but you don't want to push it up, so you push down everything around it that's possibly masking that frequency, but without doing so many EQ moves. So next, I gave it a little bit more excitement with this, another variety of sound plugin called Thrill Seeker. Listen to what happens when you turn it on and off. It just gives it something. I increased the drive, I gave it a little bit of air, gave it a little bit of mid-range around 6 kilohertz, which is crazy because it's not really mid, it's more high. But if you were to really crank this, it would create that airy, massive sound. But this song's a little bit more mid-rangey, so you don't want to crank the highs too much. In fact, you could probably even crank this a little bit more and get away with it. I also pushed up the lows again, ever so slightly around 200 hertz, because I remember in your original track, RIP headphone users warning coming up.
Let it slide. Let your troubles fall behind.
You made your snare massive, and I mean like freaking massive with the low end. Even though it kind of made it sound like a trash can, we really don't want to lose any of that bottom end. So you want some of that thickness, which is why every stage of the game, in between all the curves, I'm also adding a little bit of 200 hertz each time, because that's where I think the body of this snare lies. So next, from added body, we get Ferric TDS, which is a tape emulation by Variety of Sound. Again, Variety of Sound does literally no wrong when it comes to free plugins. So what I'm doing is, it's kind of adding a lot of tape saturation and limiting the snare a little bit, but it's also adjusting the dynamics, so it's kind of acting like tape compression in a way, with a side chain in the low area, just so that if there's any low-end rumble, it won't cause the dynamics to go out of whack. Especially since I haven't actually high passed any of this snare. Ooh, yeah. Listen to this. It's subtle, but it makes a difference. So, there you have it on that. Next, I compress the snare harder with Grand Comp. Just, again, lightly. 0 to 5 at most. I've got it set for a fat reduction, an attack just after the transient at 35 milliseconds, and a release of 7 milliseconds. The character switch, which would be bright, hot, or loud, I chose loud because it's already pretty bright, already pretty hot. We just need to increase the volume overall. Oh, yeah. See that? Just peak in gain reduction just a little bit. So, the last thing I did, clipped it. Clipped the transient. I know you like that loud snare sound because you had it in your mix. So what I did was I took G-Clip, again, a free clipping plugin, and you can really hear it makes a huge difference in the mix, just ever so slightly. For virtually no more dB at all, it increases the sound monumentally, volume-wise. It really brings out, like, the room of the snare, too. So, next, what I did was, I hate those toms. I hate them a lot. I'm gonna loop this section, but just so you know, I hate these toms. They are my least favorite part of MT Power Drummer. So what I did first was, I changed them quite a bit with EQ. I cut 4 kilohertz as much as I could without losing character, and compensated by boosting it just as much in the highs. So you're losing some of that trash canniness, but you're boosting the highs so you get more stick attack. Then what I did was I boosted the mid-range of them around 1.5 kilohertz, which may be where some of the stick attack is going to be, but if you remove it, it suddenly feels dead, right? If you give too much, it sounds like it's punching cardboard. So give it just enough to give it the character of the toms getting hit. And then I increased the low end over here, this time around 100 hertz, 90 hertz, so that instead of sounding boomy, and instead of sounding like there's literally no low end, just give it enough low end to feel fat in the mix. Again, I'm driving these pretty hard, but through a modern tube emulation. Same Boots EQ. Up next, we've got Sun EQ, which I'm actually lowering around 2 kilohertz of the mid-range with this because I cannot stand the trash canniness of these toms. Gotta get rid of that, son. I passed it up to about 57 hertz because, of course I can. Low pass it to about 17 kilohertz because I'm trying to boost the highs again, and I don't like how MT Power Drummer responds to highs. I think overall these are way too trebly as drums. But now they sound a lot fatter. I also boosted around 100 hertz with a low shelf, but then attenuated it ever so slightly so it creates that almost Pultec effect of creating a resonance there. I like that. I like that low-end resonance. Add in pretty much the same exact settings of the snares tape machine, and you've got a massive sound. It barely even changes the volume. In fact, if anything, it practically lowers the volume in most places. But it definitely evens out the dynamics and brings out the big character of those toms. Next up, I compress them. These are actually getting compressed a little harder than the snare, but pretty much the same settings. I just made the attack a little faster and the release a little faster, and changed the ratio to be lower so that you don't crush the toms. I do not like crushed toms. And then G-Clip, so that we can bring up the overall volume of them in the mix without making them sound too much like trash cans, so that they keep up with the rest of the drums. So now you hear that, but what's missing, you may ask? What could possibly be missing? Well, let me tell you, son. A room. By default, these samples sound decently roomy, but still pretty dry. So, I'm gonna take this free Sanford Reverb, which just came out this last year as free for the first time ever. So I took that, sent all of the tracks of the drum bus to Sanford Reverb. The overhead, I made that pre-fader so I could get a little more volume out of it. The kick, pre-effects. So if you're listening to just the dry signal of the reverb, the kick actually has less click. It has more of the natural quotation marks, kick, sample, body, and all that. But then the snare, I have sent pre-fader, but post-effects. So all the processing I did on everything is still attached, except the kick, because I didn't like how that sounded. So you'll notice on the reverb, I have a high cut around 7.5 kilohertz and a low cut around 64 hertz. Everything else is just completely wet. The reverb level is at least with early reflections blended in at about the same level as the reverb tails themselves, because I want it to be more room sound like you would hear in a drum room, as opposed to, wow, this microphone is really far away. So everything else is just the time, 16, 36 milliseconds, 58 milliseconds, etc., just to create that feeling like you're in a room with disparate walls that the drums are being recorded in. Now, what I don't really like is a lot of high end in my drum rooms, because it creates a washy feeling that actually conflicts with the original drums. So I'm going to turn off the EQ here. Hear how without the EQ it's a lot brighter, but it feels like it's lacking in body. The easy trick is to take a high shelf, put it at whatever frequency you find offensive, and just lower it by like 2 to 3 dB. I also cut out a little bit of the honkier body stuff that made itself really evident after that happened. That actually conflicted with the original dry signal. And I took a high pass up to 80 hertz, but made it a resonant high pass filter so that it boosted around 100 to 80 hertz, because I do like that low end of the room. Now, listen to it without. It's blended just enough to make a difference, right? All right, good. So now, how about that bass? Do you like bass, kid? I like bass. I'm actually a bassist. All right, let's check out what I did, because I didn't do a ton. You'll notice this MIDI transpose is here just because the virtual instrument that I used didn't like the range that you had it programmed in. I'm just raising it an octave so that my bass instrument can hear it. Now, check it out. This is a bass, a free bass plugin called Forefront Bass. Absolutely free, 0 settings. You can't change anything about it. Nothing at all. Everything you program into MIDI is what you get. So, after that, I took the free Pulse Impost Loader, got the Kubishkin IR Cab Mix Pack, which, completely free, has some great bass stuff, and low pass it to 4 kilohertz because there was way too much twang going on if I didn't, and high-end resonances, and then high passed it to like 60 to 70 hertz. Now, why would I do that on the bass? Well, I'll tell you why. Because I needed to free up room for the kick drum. That's why. If you notice, I also take a high pass from about 5 kilohertz up here, because the low pass of Pulse really isn't that heavy. It's really a light low pass filter. So, again, take the high pass here because there was still a lot of low end in the bass. Cut out some of these 700 hertz frequencies that were boxy and fake sounding, and some of these 300 hertz frequencies and 400 hertz frequencies that were initially conflicting with the guitar tones. I also boosted 1 kilohertz or around there so that the bass still had some body. If I were to get rid of the high pass here, it'd be a lot of sub-frequencies that just kind of boom outward. So to tighten up the bass, I did that. Bass, I don't spend a lot of time on because if you got a good bass tone, you've got a decent foundation, you really don't have to do all that much. And with a song like this, you don't even have to make it heavy and chunky and crunch crunch. Brutal. So, I also have this free Tdr Compressor. As you'll notice, every single thing I did in the mix is a free plugin. Took an attack of 16 milliseconds because that's immediately after the initial transient it clamps down, and then release it relatively quickly. So unless something is sustaining loudly, it will keep the gain reduction on. I had to set the threshold pretty low just because that was the volume level of the forefront bass module, which, again, no settings. So, that was literally all I did for bass. Bass module, cab, not even a head, EQ, and light compression, no more than 6 dB at any given time. Wow. In fact, if I wanted to adjust the compression even more, I could set this sidechain frequency so that it doesn't compress really hard on the low notes. I like that. From here, let's focus on what's happening with the rhythm guitars. So the rhythm guitars, fun story. I gated them a little bit just because they had some inherent noise to them. I took a Tube Screamer emulation from the Serena experiment, which I've bought all of their stuff that you can buy, but their free stuff is still incredible. If I enable it, you'll notice how it makes it almost like honky, right? That little bit of drive adds to harmonic enrichment, and the tone knob pushes the upper mids a little more out there. I also increased the volume because gain staging, because these are all pretty quiet. So, which head did I choose and why? Well, I listened to your original mix, and the tones sounded decently British to me, so I was down. Now, the original sounded really fizzy and high-endy, and the only way I could really think to get close to that without it becoming a distorted mess was to use a British head, like a Marshall. So I used Hybrid by Pouline. Input's about here. Channel is the Marshall channel, the MCJ, with a lowest drive at around 3 to 4. I cranked it because that's how guitar tabs are made to be played through, is when you crank everything. I'm joking, of course, but I did want to gain stage it, so quality's high, routing is stereo because I'm feeding both of the original tracks into the parent track of the rhythm guitar bus. You can do that too in whatever DAW you're using. So it's Tube Screamer into Hybrid Head with these settings because I really wanted it to be pretty ballsy. And then I'm using the Pulse Impulse Loader. Now, what I'm using this in is the 1960A cabinets from, I believe it was Red Wires, but don't quote me on that. But yeah, totally free. I'm using the one of the Audix i5 impulses, which is 4 inches and 1.5 C. I'd have to take a look at the pictures again to remember what that means, but after playing with some of them, I found that I liked this one the most because it had a good combination of body and high-end. After which, I noticed that some of the resonances up and around here, I was seeking and destroying. Just so that there's none of those whistling things. Also, got rid of a little bit of 440 hertz where it was muddying up a little bit. But not too much because that's pretty much the body of the guitar. I also high-passed it around 100 hertz and 8.9 kilohertz because there was a lot of gainy whistling and also a lot of flub in the low end that was competing with bass. which you should hear them melding together a lot better. With those EQ choices. So the final link in the chain, which instead of compressing or limiting, I'm using this tape saturator. Again, ferric TDS. It can do no wrong. I took it and I went, that sounds good. Cranked the saturation, increased the side chain a little bit, set the recovery to be a little bit slower, so now it's compressing into the tape a little bit harder and taking a little bit longer before it lets up. And letting it peak a little bit into the tape itself. So the limiter turns red occasionally. It's getting a ton of saturation from that. I really like that guitar tone. I think it's pretty decent. So now that you've got drums, bass, and guitar, what are we going to do? Oh, right, we need lead guitar. Now, I started out with this lead guitar, saying to myself, well, I kind of need to denoise it because it comes with a pretty decently high noise floor. So I took this, which is a free dynamics processor from Kakos, who makes Reaper, created a noise profile in the subtractive mode just to get rid of some of the noise that was here and originally here. If you go down to about 120 dB, you can see what a difference it actually made, especially once we get into see, you get this noise that's awful if you don't gate it. And really what this does is it tackles just the noise, and then the gate comes in and says everything above that noise is golden to clamp down on. And the initial EQ is just to high pass it below 100 hertz, because that's typically where you're going to find 60 hertz hum and all that other stuff. So if there was any grounding issues, then that would come through in this. So that's all just cleaning it up. So next, I used the free Emissary Head from Ignite Amps. Fantastic head. I cranked the bass, low mids, and just a little bit, like just past where the 6 would be on a normal amp, or as one might say, 1 o'clock or so. On the high mids and the treble, crank the depth, push the treble presence just a little bit. You're in the lead channel with the bright switch turned off, turned on, turned off, turned on. It just makes a little bit of a difference when it sticks out in the mix. And also the shape switch is also on. So with that, you're going right into the Pulse cabs, Rosen Digital's Pulse, loading again from the 1960A cab from the Red Wires or wherever it is. But it's an SM57 this time. So you get a little bit more of that honk. And honestly, I didn't feel the need to EQ this at all, aside from low passing it to about 9 kilohertz, high passing it to about 150, because Emissary just sounded really good. And then lastly, in the context of the mix, it sounded really dry. So what I did was, I took my custom delay that I built, which is a multi-tap delay, it's basically my preset, where you get a whole bunch of eighth notes that gradually get, or quarter notes, that gradually get darker and darker with less frequency bandwidth. So you start at like low pass around 1K, 10K, or 9K, and then second tap is in the other ear with a low pass filter at 5.7K, and then 3K on the other side, and then so on and so forth, getting more mono and more dark as it goes along. So that sounds like this. So that creates this huge feeling as if that guitar is coming straight out of an arena. You liking it so far? I am. So, Up next is vocal. Fun thing about vocals are that they're really difficult to do with free plugins, but you can do them. So I was kind of racking my brain for a little bit, thinking, hey, what should I do? And it came to me.
Let it go.
Let it go. Actually, what I really did was I listened to the original vocal, and I said, okay, how can I get this to sounding like I want it to?
Let it go. Let it roll right off your shoulder.
Let me actually turn on this limiter again so I can get it louder.
Let it go.
So when it started, first thing I noticed was there was a decently high noise floor.
Let it go.
So I put a gate on it
Let it roll right off your shoulder. Don't you
with a
know?
little bit more of a soft setting. So slower release, longer hold, slower attack, and a pre-open just in case so that you don't get any clicks or pops on the way in. Up next, I used Thrill Seeker XTC by Variety of Sound. Honestly, just get everything they've ever made. You'll love them. They're free.
Let it go.
You'll notice immediately
Let it
stereo
roll
width
right
increase.
off your
Do you know why?
shoulder.
Because
Don't
the
you know?
Mojo knob.
The hardest part is over. Let it end. Let your clarity define you.
I loved how your lead vocal sat in the mix with a little bit of spatial widening on that Mojo knob. Oh my goodness. Also
Let it
increased the
go.
air by literally just a notch,
Let it roll
above
right off your shoulder. Don't you know?
12 kilohertz.
The hardest part is
Increased
over.
just a notch of the
Let
mids
it
around
end.
5K, which again,
Let your
highs really.
clarity define
Pushed the
you
drive a
in
little
the
bit so it
end.
acts as if you're coming out of a console,
You
and
only
pushed
just
into
remember how it feels.
a
Our lives are made in these.
an emulation of a distressor, which I actually have a whole bunch of distressor emulations, and this is not one of my favorite, but it does the job decently, and it doesn't cost anything. It's part of the Modern Plugins pack by Antress. You can see right here, it says Modern Deathcore. Yeah. But
Let it go.
I like distortion on your vocals,
Let
and I
it
like
roll
distressor
right
on your
off your
vocals. So
shoulder, don't
driving
you know?
into a distressor, in this case, I thought was pretty appropriate.
The hardest part is over.
Attack at
Let
around
it
6
end.
on the knob, and
Let
around
your
release around 3,
clarity
pushing the
define
input
you
harder so that you
in
get some
the
gain
end.
reduction, and a ratio of 6 to
You will
1.
only just remember how it feels.
Makes those vocals a lot tighter.
Our lives are made. Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
Brings them up front.
The hardest part is over. Let it end.
Now, what the heck did I just do? Did you hear that?
Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
What just happened? Well, I'll tell you what. I used another Variety of Sound plugin. That's what happened. First of all, this is nasty VCS. So this is literally a channel strip. I pushed your vocals up higher into it because it requires a certain amount of input volume or input level just to compress the way I wanted it to. So what all is happening here? First of all,
Let it roll right off.
I'm saturating it.
Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
You can hear that immediately.
The hardest part is over.
And I'm high passing it up to a certain point around 100 hertz.
Let it roll right off your shoulder.
But I'm boosting the lower end around 200 hertz of your vocal because that's where I found you had like a false fundamental thing going on. It was beautiful, and it created this oomph to your voice in the mix. So I boosted and cut at the same time, again, to make that Pultec thing go on with that resonance there, 200 hertz. Oh, yeah.
Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know? The hardest part is over.
And then I took 1.5 kilohertz where the voice really rang out to me. I was like, we need more of that in the mix. I pushed it up by about 2 dB
Let it go.
with a high Q so that you get this.
Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
Otherwise, your voice would sound a little duller.
The hardest part is over.
It would sound kind of hollow in the mix, which makes me sad.
Let it go. Let it roll right off.
So there it is at 1.5 kilohertz. I just pushed that up a little. And then, again, 5 kilohertz. Small incremental additions every single time. Added 3
Let it
kilohertz.
go.
Added about 3 dB
Let
of 5
it roll
kilohertz.
right off your
Which, if you
shoulder,
removed it-
don't you know? The hardest part
Who
is
took away the
over.
vocals, am I right?
Let it end. Let your clarity define you in the
And then
end.
an air knob, which does some crazy harmonic saturation or something. I put it at 8K because that's where the voice sizzles the most, in my opinion, and is still within the audible range for every single person. So I pushed that up to 4. Not quite sure what that does, but it's all good.
Let it go.
It sounds great. Next,
Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
you'll notice I'm comping your voice pretty hard on that, but I'm doing it with the press attack mode, which you can't use a normal attack and release, but it gives you some general ideas of like, oh, grind, press, and slack. So of course you'd think really fast, mid-speed, super slow. And the same with the release times. Squeeze being a really fast release. Thrust, same, but then relaxed, then soft, then LA. So faster to slower is what it sounds like, in my opinion.
Let it go.
But I chose thrust because it gives you a
Let
nice
it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
tight release afterwards.
The hardest part is over, let it end.
And I like how that sounds. I'm also limiting right now, but it's not really
Let
limiting
it go.
all that much.
Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
And some makeup gain on the way out. So after that, I discovered your voice is ridiculously sibilant with all those changes. But I don't want to lower the high end because your voice was crispy. I like it.
Let it go.
So I used this simple de-esser,
Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you?
MDA DS, which is not only fun to say, but it does something cool. And you can use the high frequency
Let
drive.
it go. Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
But that was too crispy for me.
The
So I disabled
hardest
that.
part
So
is
everything
over.
over 5.7 kilohertz is getting reduced. The threshold for this de-essing is at about negative 30 dB because, again, we've got a ton of headroom in your vocal. All the signals are pretty quiet.
Let it go.
But it
Let it roll right off your shoulder.
tames a lot of those harsh S's and F's. Without,
Let it go. Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you? Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you?
makes a slight difference. And then I EQ'd it with a stock EQ, just a graphic one, where there was a weird resonance around 600 hertz, a weird resonance around 2K, and that's about it. Also high-passed it a little bit,
Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
so that your voice sounded a little less nasal there.
Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know?
So I got rid of some of that room noise and some of that awkwardness. Now, for the background vocal, I did all the same choices, except when it came to the settings, I twisted them around a little bit. So,
How it
Gate-
feels. Our lives are made in these small hours.
same kind of gate settings. For Thrill Seeker, I took the air and pushed it up from here. Same settings here, but the mojo was cranked all the way up because I wanted the stereo of the background vocals to sort of envelop the lead vocals.
Our lives are made in these small hours, these little wonders, these twists and turns of fate.
Now, with the modern deathcore, which is the distressor again,
Our lives are made
same
in
settings,
these small
just increase the input gain a
hours,
little bit so that it
these
could
little wonders.
crush it a little bit harder than the lead vocal, and also because it was a little
Falls
quieter.
away. In these small hours, these small hours still remain.
Same settings on this as well, but I actually low-passed it a little bit more and high-passed it a little bit more so that you're getting less of the fluffy around the voice and less of the high crunch around the voice. And then I'd made similar EQ decisions, except pushed down on 1.2 kilohertz.
Our lives are made in these small hours, these little wonders.
Because as you're hitting the higher notes, it seemed like the noise of you singing in that room was creating fewer modes, but it was creating modes in the harmonic. So,
Our lives are made in these small hours, these little wonders, these twists and turns.
so now they blend really nicely because I just moved a couple of things around, attacking slightly different frequencies and getting rid of the nasal 2K area that actually made a difference when I listened. It kind of hurt my ears a little bit. So, I EQ'd the bus.
Lives are made in these small hours, these little wonders, these twists and turns of fate. Our lives are made in these small hours, these little wonders, these twists and turns of fate.
Again, getting rid of some of that room mode noise and some of that 2K, just enough to get rid of some of that nasal thing that's going on the whole time. And I don't really like it, but it was there. It must have been the mic, because I know your voice doesn't sound like that all the time. So I also increased the air around 12 kilohertz. But after doing that, I noticed, hey,
our lives are made.
It needs a little bit more de-essing. So I used Spitfish. Yay, it's free. It's actually a little confusing to use because it's got a depth knob, a soft button, and sense and listen, and then you can tune it to whatever frequency range you're doing, but it doesn't really give you much information, so I just kind of had to play it by ear.
Our lives are made in these small hours.
Especially when you're saying the S syllable on both tracks, that's when it gets noticeable. So, with...
Our lives are made in these small hours.
And then without.
Our lives are made in these small hours.
The S's stand out way too much. So, on top of that, I'm just compressing the whole bus a little bit so that when you're talking...
Remember how it feels. Our lives are made.
It blends your vocal more. It squeezes them ever so slightly together.
You in the end. You will only just remember how it feels.
1 dB, then
our lives
2
are
dB.
made in these small hours, these little wonders, these twists and turns of fate.
Without.
Time falls away
With.
in these small hours.
See, it's like butter. Crispy butter. So, up next, I had vocal delay, which I actually broke into my secret stash and used Lagrange, which came out recently. It's free. It's really cool. It's actually a really weird delay. So let me show you why. Keep in mind, I'm sending the vocal bus to it post-fader, so all the changes I made to the vocal bus are being sent to the delay and the reverb. Not the original vocal tracks themselves, but just the fully processed tracks into the fully processed bus into the delay. So listen to the delay. So what it's doing right now is using a phased algorithm, which creates this like unique delay where it creates a granular reverb delay, timed density, all that stuff with crosstalk feedback. I have a high cut at around 1.7 kilohertz because I really don't want it to sound... I don't want it to compete with the original vocal. And with the low cut, I did that just so that there's no low-end noise or rumble in the delay itself. So the vocal's with that.
In these small hours, these little wonders, these twists and turns of fate.
Now that's a really weird sounding delay, but in context of the mix, it sounds really cool. Up next is the reverb. The reverb is your basic free plate reverb by Tal. Now, I never really use it. It's really, really bright in my opinion, but I used it here and just cut down on the brightness. Without EQ. This EQ curve is the same exact one that I placed on the delay channel, but on the delay, I actually lowered the effectiveness of the EQs by about 2 dB each, or 3 dB each. So, on the reverb, I actually have a tremendous cut of the high end. Especially because the S's came through hard in the reverb. Oh my goodness, this is such a sizzly plate reverb. But I chose a plate because that's exactly the kind of reverb sound that you had in the original. I just wanted to make it sound a little bit less apparent. So now you've got vocals with reverb.
Lives are made in these small hours, these little wonders, these twists and turns of fate. Time falls away in these small hours, these small hours.
So you've got these really spacious feel in the vocals, and you've got this crazy feel in the reverb. Just vocals and reverb?
Lives are made in these small hours, these little wonders, these twists.
The pre-delay is set to like 15 milliseconds, which is after the initial transient. So it does create this kind of separate feel. So it's not just a reverb that sounds like you're in the room. It's a reverb that sounds like you're in a bigger room, even though the room size itself is like a third of what it could be, and the highs are all cut pretty hard. The stereo power of this reverb is insane. It's actually really hard to rein in without almost killing the lushness of it. But it's a free reverb, so you get what you get. So now I'm going to turn down the volume a little bit on the recording and show you guys what I did to master it, just ever so slightly. So, first up, Equilibre. It's free, but it's discontinued, so if you can find another good mid-side EQ, please share it. Absolutely one of my favorite old-school EQs. I actually used this on a lot of releases in about 2014, 2015. So, first thing I did was I high-passed the low end just up to about 30 hertz with a good slope on both the left and the right channels. I then took a side EQ, literally just a low shelf on the sides, so that the guitars come through much clearer and feel like they're wrapping around you and enveloping you. Oh my goodness, it's a sweet sound, I think, personally. So this is what it would sound like if I exaggerated that low shelf a little bit more. If I cut it completely. I do like just a little bit of that low mid sound there. And then right at the top of it, around the sides, I actually cut at around 500 to 600 hertz because that's just after the boost I made on the shelf. So it creates this kind of inverse resonance where it actually cuts down on the peak of the shelf. But that was a little bit more difficult to do with the Q on this one because it really just smooths out the curve, or it makes it resonant if it's a high shelf. So that I did on the side as well. So now the sides are EQ'd a little bit differently. The mids are the mid and side are processed differently, but I didn't really do anything to the mids. I just EQ'd the sides differently on this. So on the sides, I also have a high shelf going on at about 2 dB at 12 kilohertz. Because I wanted everything on the sides just to ring a little bit nicer. Personally, I think it does good things to the cymbals. So after that, I had a multiband compressor up, which really is just working for the low end. Really, I'm tightening up the low end so that it doesn't peak out of control. It's a lot more controlled because the first mix I did of this had a really weird bass, and once I turned on the sub, it actually was really flubby and out of control. So you're saving headroom, you're cutting down on that with just this 220 to about 140 hertz low band. Keeping the low end consistent just slightly. I'm not really doing anything to the others, but I'm increasing the gain by about 2 decibels so that when it cuts down, for example, at like 2.5, yeah, you're missing like a half a decibel, but when it only cuts down on like 1 dB, you're actually boosting that entire band by about 1 dB. So you're keeping the bass pretty consistent. Up next, tape. I like it. Way less dynamic controls, faster recovery as possible because I don't want the tape to actually compress it, and just enough saturation that it becomes noticeable. So, on top of that, there's really not much left I can do. I actually did what is called Modern Monoizer, again in the Andres bundle, which takes everything below the area of the filter and cuts it down to mono, because in psychoacoustical principles, they have basically discovered that low end is omnidirectional, and it's probably one of the oldest principles of audio, I think. But anything under like 120 hertz, 140 hertz, we perceive as mono anyway, so cutting it to mono just kind of lightens the load on the sides in the mix, which is pretty good, makes it come through as mono if it's below a certain threshold, and it creates the exact kind of sound that our brains would expect. It doesn't sound radically different, but it makes the mind a little bit more cozy. Everything mono. Nothing mono. So yeah, especially if you have a sub or really high-end studio monitors, you'll notice the difference. Up next, I have this limiter. Yay! You'll notice outright that I'm getting at least like 8 dB of gain out of this thing, because I'm pushing up here on the compressor. I have a 1.5 ratio, which means a ratio of 1.5 decibels for every decibel it goes over. And a relatively quick attack, probably I'd say 50 milliseconds, if that's what this is based off of. And I think it is, because it responds pretty similar to the SSL plugins I use. And an instant release, I'm basically cutting back 1 to 2 dB at any given time. I don't like to crush a mix, but it's a mid-side compression, so you've got mid compressing differently than sides, so that's good. I like what it does to the width of a mix. And then I'm pushing it 3.5 more dB into a peak limiter. Completely multiband, by the way, so in the louder sections, sometimes you'll see like the low mids get cut back a little bit, or the bass get cut back a little bit, although less with that multiband compressor I used earlier. And I think it sounds great, personally. So, I also have this high floor limiter, which is cutting down on the highs if they get egregious. And I know that's all subjective, but I kind of do like how it can cut back on high end before I even have to do anything, and it's on a almost like a multiband compression basis. But yeah, it doesn't let it get too out of hand. Only set a threshold of about -2.2 dB there, so that if there's anything radical like an errant S or something, it can catch that. I also have the clipper enabled. It's not doing much except getting a little bit of gain, and then the protection, which is basically going to be your actual limiter for the final stage of volume, is I'm pushing it out by about 0.5 into a very fast protected limiter so that it reacts quickly and then lets go quickly. I think that's important so that you don't get like a really slow, pumpy mix. And it's only really catching about 1 or 2 dB worth of peaks. Up next, I use span to make sure that everything is even. Now, I think when I cranked this air up too much, it actually pushed the 4K and the 6K out of proportion with the rest of the mix, so there was a reason I had it set that way. So yeah, you may find that you've got some things going on in the peaking of certain frequency bands. Totally natural, totally fine, just correct for it so that you don't have anything pushing too hard. And then I noticed that the loudness is going to about 9 dB at the loudest parts.
Our lives
I really don't want to push it past negative 9 dB RMS just because I want it to be somewhat dynamic. So that's how the mix sounds as of right now. Hopefully YouTube compression doesn't destroy it. But yeah, listen at the highest quality. Again, if you want. It's been over an hour, and I'm hoping you got something out of this. Now let's hear the difference between your mix and my mix one more time, and we'll see what we can glean from that.
Let it go. Let it roll right off your shoulder, don't you know? Over, let it end. Let your clarity define you in the end. You will only just remember how it feels.
So, if you want something changed, you could change it. You could lower the volume of the guitars. You could automate that. But regardless, I think we've got a pretty kick-butt sounding mix right now, and hopefully you do too. So I'll upload this soon, and I hope you enjoyed or got something out of it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section or contact me directly. I'm always open for Q&As, that kind of thing. So, thanks again, and see you guys later.